Yoshi looked at James. I need to go to the bathroom. James nodded. I'll watch the room, and if you try to leave, I'll stop you. Okay. James left the room and went to sit outside the bathroom door. He kept his eye on the room, and when Yoshi tried to leave, he shouted, "Stop." Oh, you're not gonna let me go? No. Yoshi sighed and stopped trying to leave. James, however, kept his eye on him. He was not quite sure what the boy's plan was. James had been sitting there for a while, when the lights flickered on and then went off. There was a clattering sound, as if the building around them was hitting the ground, and then there was silence. James stood and checked his surroundings. No one was in the room. He walked over to the door and looked out cautiously. The hallway was dark and cold. There was a faint light in the distance, but it was too far away for James to figure out what it was. James put his head out further and listened. There was the quiet clacking of his shoes on the floor, and the air was filled with the smell of the sea. James smiled and stepped out into the hallway. James hurried down the hallway. The cold wind bit his face, and he shivered. James looked up at the sky, which was overcast, and thought that it was probably nighttime. James checked his watch. It was almost 9 p.m. James walked more quickly. He wondered where he was. James came to a fork in the hallway, and stood at the junction. There was a door on the right, and a window on the left. James could see trees outside the window, and a path underneath the window. The doorway was dark. James took a step forward, and the floor creaked. James quickly backed up against the wall. He looked at the window. The glass was small, and James could see only a shadow moving against the background. James looked at the door. It was wooden, and had a doorknob. James tried to turn the knob, but it was rusted shut. James looked around the junction. There was no other choice but to open one of the doors. James opened the door on the left, and stepped inside. James found himself in a wooden room. There was a table on the left side, with 6 chairs around it. There was a man in the center, facing the table. James thought the man was looking at the sea. He was tall and slender. He had short, black hair and a dark complexion. James thought that the man might be African American. James approached the man. "Are you the leader of this group?" James asked. The man looked up and frowned. "Leader of what group?" James repeated the question. "The group of people who are fucking with my house," the man said. James said, "I'm James." "What's your name?" The man frowned, and said, "You're not in a position to be asking me any questions." James said, "I'm not trying to start anything. I'm trying to get my family out of this house." "Well, you should talk to the king." James said, "What's the king's name?" "Koi." James said, "Is she the only one here?" The man said, "There's a princess." James said, "All alone?" The man said, "The boy and I are the only two. The king and the princess left on an errand not too long ago." James said, "Where do they go?" The man said, "To the Toulon kingdom." James frowned. "Why do you want to go there?" The man said, "To get a new crown." James said, "What's a crown?" The man said, "A crown is what you put on your head." James said, "First don't wear a crown." The man said, "Yes, you do. Everyone wears a crown." James said, "First don't wear a crown." The man said, "You wear one on your head." James looked at his head. There was no crown there. James said, "First don't wear a crown." James looked at the floor. There was a crown there, on the floor. James picked up the crown. He held it in his hands, and examined it. It was a metal crown, and had a thin layer of gold on top. James said, "This is a crown. I don't wear one." James tossed the crown to the man. The man said, "It's not just a crown. It's the only thing that can make you king." James said, "I'm not king." James looked around. There was no one else in the room. James said, "Where is the king and the princess?" The man said, "The king is in the Toulon kingdom, where the land is most fertile. The princess is with him." James said, "Do you know where that is?" The man said, "I can take you there." James followed the man. James said, "How far is it to the Toulon kingdom?" The man said, "Not far. By boat, it takes about a week." James said, "What about the people who live in the Toulon kingdom? Do you know them?" The man said, "We're not too well off. We don't have enough food. The people there are very powerful, and many come to our shores." James said, "Many come to your shore?" The man said, "Often." James said, "But not this time?" The man said, "Not this time." James said, "Why?" The man said, "The Toulon kingdom has many secrets. We're not allowed to interfere." James said, "But you're interfering in this." James pointed to the sky, where the sun was just now rising. James said, "And you're also causing this." James pointed at the sea. James said, "Because of this." James held his hands out, and made a chopping motion. James said, "You're both causing and being caused." James held his hands out, and said, "Let's just be reasonable." The man said, "You want to know why we're here? We're here because the king needs new land. That's why." James said, "I'm not starting anything, or getting involved. I just want my family back." James pointed to the sky. James said, "And this?" James made a circular motion with his finger. James said, "First want you to stop." James made a fist. James said, "I'm not going to ask again." James's face turned red, and his jaw clenched. James said, "First want you to stop." James made a motion with his hands. James said, "Let's be reasonable. And go." James and the man went to the boat, and took seats. James said, "I'm James. This is my brother, Michael. We're the Yandees. We're fishermen." James pointed to himself. James said, "I'm going to need a name. What should I call you?" James thought for a moment. The man said, "You can call me Grolic." Grolic spelled backwards is Kralik. James said, "How about Kralik?" James liked the name Kralik. Kralik was a strong and powerful name. The name meant, light of the sky. James said, "What should we call him?" Grolic said, "I guess we should call him Mock." James said, "Mock?" James spelled it backwards as Mog. Grolic said, "Yes." James said, "That's a strange name. What does it mean?" Grolic said, "It's an old Azorian name. It means moss." James said, "Moss? How odd." James smiled. James said, "We need to start a fire to keep warm. There's no point in sitting here in the cold." James went to the boat's fireplace, and put wood in it. James said, "What do you need?" Grolic said, "A boat." James said, "We'll need a boat to cross the ocean." James went to the boat, and brought back another piece of wood. James said, "What are you going to do?" Grolic said, "I'm going to build a boat." James said, "You're going to build a boat?" James looked at Grolic's hands. James said, "They're calluses. They'll weather the weather." James looked around. There was nothing to do. James said, "How long will it take you?" Grolic said, "I don't know. A few hours, I guess." James said, "Let us come with you." James and Grolic went to the boat, and worked together. James took the oars. And Grolic took the piece of wood and shaped it into a boat. James said, "We don't have any oars." James got wood, and shaped it into oars. James said, "The oars are too heavy. The ocean is too rough for oars. We should have thought of that before." James looked at the ocean. James said, "We should have a pole." James went to the boat's fishing pole, and shaped it into a rudder. James said, "We don't need a rudder. The boat will be pulled by the current." James went to the boat's fishing net, and shaped it into a sail. James said, "We don't need a sail. The boat will be propelled by the wind." James and Grolic finished the boat. James said, "First hope this boat floats. What do you think?" James and Grolic sat down in the boat. James said, "We're ready. Are you going to sit or stand?" Grolic said, "I'm going to sit." James said, "Are you sure? You can sit on the sail. It'll be easier to steer with both hands." James stood up. James said, "I'll stand." I don't want to sit in your boat. James sat down in the boat. James said, Are you able to sit in the back? James looked at Grolic. James said, Yes, but can you? James stood up. James said, Then I'm going to sit in the back. James sat down in the boat. James said, Should we start to head to the ocean? James and Grolic sat in the dark. James said, Wait. Before we go into the ocean, we should say goodbye to land. Let's swim to the far end. James and Grolic swam to the far end of the beach. James said, We made it. We should go now. The water might not be so far. James and Grolic entered the water. James said, Swim to the right. It'll take us to the other side of this inlet. James and Grolic swam to the right. James said, We should go. James and Grolic swam to the other side. James said, Come on. James swam to the surface. James said, We're here. James and Grolic walked out of the water. James said, Let's go. James and Grolic walked. James said, There's no need to swim against the current. It's faster this way. James and Grolic walked. James said, We should probably keep to the right to avoid the rocks. This inlet is a little wider than the other inlets. The currents might be stronger because of it. James and Grolic walked. James said, We need to find a place to cross the inlet. James and Grolic walked. James said, The current flows through here. It's a little stronger than it is in the other inlets. It would be harder to cross without getting wet. James and Grolic walked. James said, There's a rock formation along here. Maybe we can climb up to a ledge and jump across. James and Grolic walked. James said, It won't be easy. Maybe we should swim around the rock formation. James and Grolic walked. James said, Let's swim across now. It's faster. James and Grolic swam. James said, It's not much of a current. We should be able to swim across. James and Grolic swam. James said, It's fast swimming. It's way faster than walking across. James and Grolic swam. James said, We should get out of the water and climb onto land. James and Grolic climbed onto the rock formation. James said, If we can get onto the top of this rock, we can jump across. James and Grolic walked up the rocky embankment. James said, There should be a path up. We'll just have to be careful. These rocks are slippery. James and Grolic climbed. James said, Be careful. It's a long drop. James and Grolic got to the top. James said, This should be easy. James and Grolic climbed down. James said, It's not. James and Grolic slipped. James fell. James said, We're going to have to jump. Grab my hand. James and Grolic clasped hands. James said, You first. James and Grolic stood on the slippery rocks. James said, Be careful. James and Grolic stood on the rocks. James said, Let go. James and Grolic let go of each other and James fell, screaming, into the water. James said, Grab my hand. James and Grolic grabbed each other. James said, We're going to fall. Lean forward, and grab onto my arm. James and Grolic leaned forward. James held onto Grolic's hand. James took a deep breath. James said, We're going to fall. Just relax and enjoy the ride. James and Grolic rode the waterfall. James said, Can you see the waterfall? James and Grolic stood up. James said, Yes. James and Grolic walked down the rocks. James said, You got a little wet. James and Grolic walked. James said, We should continue on to the ocean. James and Grolic walked. James said, We should keep to the right. There's a current that could take us back into the land. James and Grolic walked. James said, First, don't see any land anywhere. James and Grolic walked. James said, Maybe it's because there is no land. James and Grolic walked. James said, Maybe this is the end of the world. James stood on the rocky embankment. James said, I'm not ready to give up. James and Grolic walked. James said, Maybe there's someplace else we can go to. James and Grolic walked. James said, We can try the boat club. Maybe they have a radio we can use to call for help. James and Grolic walked. James said, We don't know how far we have to go. We don't have any food. James and Grolic walked. James said, we need to find a farm or something. We can eat the seeds off the plants. James and Grolic walked. James said, do you see any farms? James and Grolic walked. James said, no. James said, I don't think we should keep going. Maybe we should find a place to hide for a little while. James and Grolic sat down on the rocky embankment. James said, we should probably close our eyes for a little while. We might be here a long time. James and Grolic closed their eyes. James said, if we fall asleep, we might slip off the edge and be crushed to death. James and Grolic sat. James said, we might be here a long time. So we should probably get comfortable. James and Grolic stretched. James said, if we're going to fall, it might as well be to a nice view. James and Grolic yawned. James said, maybe we can build a fire. James and Grolic pulled out tinder. James said, first, don't think there's any flammable liquid on this island. James and Grolic built a fire. James said, I wish we had some wood. James and Grolic sat by the fire. James said, how about if we swim around the island? There has to be something we can use to build a shelter. James and Grolic walked. James said, first, don't see anything. James and Grolic walked. James said, there has to be something. There always is. We just have to look harder. James and Grolic walked. James said, we could look under the trees. James and Grolic walked. James said, there might not be anything that we can use. There could be something, though. James and Grolic walked. James said, if there's nothing, we'll just have to build a fire and put it out. James and Grolic sat down. James said, I'm going to go look under the trees. You stay here and look out for a while. Okay? James and Grolic sat. James said, be careful. The footing could be treacherous. James and Grolic looked. James said, we're fine. James and Grolic looked. James said, I don't see anything. James climbed up the rocks. James said,